Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Becky, I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm delighted to be along for the ride with the session this afternoon. A quick word about the EA, who we are and what we do. We're a learned society and subject association, which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through to secondary and further education, to higher education and beyond. And we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you ever so much to our panel this evening, who will be introduced with the right amount of ceremony in a couple of moments. Our members also make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. Membership starts at just £29 and enables you to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Enough from me, let's get to the good stuff, and it's my pleasure to pass over to Professor Robert Eaglestone. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for giving up your time this evening. It's going to be really worthwhile because the research that we're talking about today is one of the most important bits of research in our discipline, kind of full stop. Everyone in our subject ought to know about the research we're going to be talking about today. So I'm incredibly grateful for Shenila, Eric and Simon to be with us today. So I'm going to introduce them very quickly. Simon is a Professor of Economics in the School of Economics at the University of Bristol. He's a Fellow of the British Academy and a Research Fellow at the Institute of the Study of Labour, with an interest in education economics, obviously, labour economics, inequality and poverty. Shenila Rawal is an applied economist specialising in education, labour markets and issues of gender and poverty. She's been an external consultant to several organisations like the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the World Bank, and she's the managing partner of the Oxford Partnership for Education Research and Analysis, an organisation that engages in pioneering research and evaluations on education policy and practice globally. Eric Taylor is a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's also affiliated with the Centre for Economic Policy at Harvard. So one of the things I learned in my institution in the last 2 or 3 years, having hung out with more economists, is that I kind of thought economists was to do with money, but in fact, economists just measure things. That's what economists do. They measure things. And the reason for giving an introduction to these three people is to tell you they're really good at measuring. Okay. And that's really important because I want to say a couple of things before we kick off. We believe in evidence-led teaching and evidence-led teaching, and for that we need research. One of the reasons that academics can be quite boring is because we often ask, like, what is the evidence? Where is the research? What's this based on? And when you do that with lots of current ideas that influence the pedagogy in our discipline, we discover quite odd things. So a very famous influencer who demands direct instruction on Macbeth for your year 10s bases that claim on an article which claims that experiential-based teaching doesn't work, which is itself based on a study of 80 final year medical students from California in the 1990s. Big size of 80. Like as if characters from the pit are the same as your year 10s on a rainy Thursday. You'll see the evidence that these economists are going to discuss is not like that. It's kind of gold-plated evidence. Now, as a kind of footnote to that, I had to get 2 of my economic colleagues at Royal Holloway to take me through the article to explain. So one of the things we're going to do in this session is, if you want something clarified as we're going through, we're going to do what economists do and have interruptions. And the way we're going to do that is it just write in the chat, please can you explain that, please go over that, I don't quite follow that, whatever it might be. Becky will do the interrupting, okay, and Shenila and Simon and Eric will kind of stop and explain. I hope that sounds okay. So the reason we're having this session is because I believe, like lots of us believe, that dialogue is at the heart of English, of what it is as a discipline. And so obviously as its pedagogy, it's part of its signature pedagogy is to do with dialogue. And I say this to teachers and managers of teachers all the time. And a few months ago, I was at an awarding body event discussing the new curriculum or potential new curriculum. And I was speaking to a head of English, and I said this thing about dialogue. And she said, like, I know, but when I try and tell my senior management team that we shouldn't use the same techniques as they use in geography or maths, they just roll their eyes. What am I going to do? And so I turned to her and said, well, let me tell you about this article. Okay. And I did the best I could to explain it. I have tried to explain it in writing, but Becky and I, the English Association, thought we should go to the horses' mouths. And here are, I've lost my metaphors, going to be in trouble. Here are the horses. So please, as if you were speaking to that teacher that I turned to at that event, tell us about it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Becky, and thank you so much, Bob. On behalf of Eric, Simon, and myself, I just also wanted to thank you very much for taking the time and hearing what we have to say and engaging with our research. We're also really excited to share our findings with you, but more than that, we're really excited to hear about your perspectives from your experiences and how they relate to what we are doing and what you think of what we're doing and your questions. So thank you very much in advance for those as well. I'm only going to take a couple of moments of your time just to set the scene of our research and talk a bit about the motivation behind this project, some of the existing and very robust evidence base on which we were aiming to build, the gaps we were hoping to fill, and also how we collected the data that we've collected. And then I will hand over to Eric, who will present our results from our project. So the first and most important thing, Eric, if I could ask you to go to the first slide, is the importance of teachers. And it is a given that we all know, not only from our own experiences of our time in school, but of potentially others in our family we know or in the schools in which we teach, that teachers are incredibly important. We'll always remember that very, very dynamic teacher who was so effective in imparting learning on us and inspired us. And we'll also remember the other teachers as well. But there is a huge evidence base in the economics of education that looks at measuring this and giving us an evidence base for it and saying that teachers are not only educationally very significant, but they've actually been shown to be the most important factor outside of your home to determine not only the grades that you get, but a lot of other outcomes. They've also been shown to be having, so when we look at things like family background, there's a lot of research that has shown that if you were to have all effective teachers, so these are teachers who would be judged above average as compared to those judged below average, you can actually halve the 2-year GCSE penalty score of poverty. So these are huge impacts on grades that have been measured. In terms of sort of the economics of it, it's also been said that replacing sort of 5 to 8% of the least effective teaching strategies with an averagely effective teaching could give you a present discounted value of over $1 trillion in terms of earnings and things like that. But it's not just about the grades, and there are lots of measures of effective teaching that have shown, that what the impact that teachers have. But it goes beyond that as well. And there's a literature base that shows, and we're not going to present these findings, but even within our project, we looked at other things. So we looked at, non-grade outcomes. So you could look at absences, suspensions, peer relations, motivations for students to want to learn, things like that, aspirations, teachers matter for aspirations. So there are lots of wider things. I think where there is sort of a lot of gaps in the research understanding what it is that makes one person more effective than another, and what does effective teaching look like. And so you have a body of evidence that looks at who these teachers are, their characteristics. So it may be their years of experience, it may be if they're a subject specialist, it could be what training they've done, it could be their contracts, how are they set up, how is their incentive pays, things like that. Or is it about what the teachers do? And that is the most important thing for our research today, is what it is that teachers do within their classrooms, which can sometimes be referred to as a bit of a black box of teaching, because a lot of teaching happens within that classroom and others don't get to see it. So we wanted to understand a little bit more, and particularly in this paper, on the activities that that teachers engage in within their classes. We can go on to the next slide. Thanks, Eric. So what we did was in 2014-15 academic year and 2015-16 academic year, we went into schools that were part of a randomized control trial. So schools are randomly selected to be part of the intervention or to be a control school. We looked at GCSE and English and maths. The entire faculty would be involved. And we conducted observations, and they were conducted by peers. So peers within your own school, who were randomly selected to either be observed, to be an observer, or some of the teachers took on both roles. And you would go into your colleagues' lessons, you would observe them for about 15 or 20 minutes, and you had a rubric which was based on a US rubric that we had adapted to fit the English context. And you'd be observed on parameters looking at effective teaching within this rubric, but you were also observed on activities that you were doing. And so this resulted in 2,700 classroom observations. The typical teacher was observed 8 times over the 2 years. And the aim, and the reason why it was set up like this, is we wanted to see teaching happening as normal. We didn't want a one-off observation where a teacher is, it's not the norm for them. It's also done. So a lot of the schools that we went into, I spoke to them and I said to them, do you do peer observation? I was quite surprised that very few of them did it. And all of them had observations. Obviously, you have to have observations taking place, but they tended to be done either by more senior teachers or by the head of department. And you definitely wouldn't have a scenario where you'd have a brand new teacher, observing a very experienced teacher, or at least it wasn't as common and not the numbers of times that we're seeing here. And so, as I said, we've got over 7,000 students and 251 teachers, and the schools were chosen based on the percentages of children on free school meals. So we were looking at a lot of schools in areas where the home background could potentially have a big influence on the students' outcomes, but also the schools themselves. So not relating to this, but one of the schools I went to, they had one maths teacher and it was a supply teacher. It wasn't a permanent member of staff. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the setting. So I think we can go on to the next slide now. So we had multiple observations, as I said. They were low stakes. So with a full CPD focus on them, the teachers were encouraged to sit down with each other afterwards and talk about what they've observed. And as I said to you, the departments were allocated as high dosage, so lots more observations, or low dosage, completely randomly. And what we looked at, I said to you, we looked at 2 things: instructional effectiveness, which we're not going to talk about today, but instructional activities. So on the next slide, you will see that the observers were recording 12 different activities. And these are the 12 activities on which they were observing. And then the way that they would assign this is they would say, was this happening none of the time? Was this happening very little proportion of the time, some of the time, most of the time, or full time. And the reason why we chose this is because in other research that has been done before, sometimes they allocate minutes. And firstly, that's very time consuming for an observer. But secondly, you don't get a real sense of those activities during the time because they could be doing several of these activities concurrently. So that was why we chose it like this. So what we ended up with, which is on the next slide, is very new and novel data that combined choices, so choices teachers make on how they are going to spend the class time across these activities. We also had ratings of instructional effectiveness, as I said, using the FFT rubric from the US. And then we had test scores. So we had GCSE results, but we also conducted some of our own bespoke tests in year 10 to get an understanding of student learning. The other thing that we did was we reached out to teacher training institutions and we asked teacher trainers their views on our rubric, on the activities, on the research that we're conducting, just to get not only a little bit of triangulation, but also just to get a sense of the fact that our research fitted in the contexts within which they are teaching. And obviously they're teaching the new teachers that are going to go out into schools. And without a doubt, they all felt that this sort of research and this evidence is really, really important. And the only thing that I would say is that as economists, Simon and Eric in particular, I do a lot more mixed methods research. What we're measuring is quantitative, and that has, Eric will talk a lot about the data and the strengths of having randomized control trials and having this quantitative, objectively measured metrics. But the other side of that is sometimes there are some nuances, behind why teachers made the choices they did, or reasons behind things that maybe you may not capture in purely quantitative data. So maybe within the questions that may come up as to how you can, add to this sort of research with some qualitative findings as well. But I'll hand over to Eric now, and he'll tell you a lot more of the details and what we found from these data we had collected.
Thanks, Shenila, and good evening. Thanks for having us. My name's Eric. I'm going to tell you about a few of the results from our research. As Shenila said, one of the novel sources of data that we have is just information on how teachers in the GCSE years are spending class time. There's a budget of time. How are we going to spend that across different activities? And so you see the 12 different activities that Shenila mentioned listed here on the left-hand side. And this graph just summarizes how how many teachers were spending none or very little time on that activity, how many teachers were spending some time on that activity, or how many teachers are spending most or all of their time on that activity. So for example, if we look at open discussion among students and teachers, which is going to become important later on, 3 out of 5 teachers over there on the right-hand side, 3 out of 5 teachers spend most or all of their time on open discussion among students and teachers. Obviously, some of these activities can be occurring at the same time. But 1 in 4 spent none or very little of their time on open discussion. And you can see several other activities here. We're going to provide these slides so you can sort of look at them in more detail later on. But, there's lots of variation in the data. Of course, using a textbook during teaching activities was quite rare. 9 out of 10, none or very little. So we have this information about how teachers are using class time. And what we wanted to understand was what's the relationship between how they're using time and how their students subsequently score on the GCSEs. There are 12 different categories of time use. We're going to collapse those down into 4 categories: student-peer interaction, personalized instruction, practice and assessment, direct instruction. How did we collapse them down? We looked at the correlation structure between those activities. What were the activities that co-occurred? So that we can sort of simplify this analysis a little bit into these 4 categories of time use. And now we're just going to look at do teachers who spend more time on one of these activities, do their students score better on GCSEs, on the GCSEs when they come around? So this graph summarizes the relationship between those 4 activities and scores on the English GCSEs. And I've highlighted one of those categories, student-peer interaction, because as you can see on this graph, it really stands out from the other categories. So those little markers, those little circle markers are telling us what is the relationship. If we increased student-peer interaction, how much would we expect GCSE scores to go up? And the answer is about 0.05. I will tell you what that means in a moment. Actually, maybe I should do that just now, and then I'll loop back to this graph briefly. But so the best way to think about this is to imagine 2 different teachers who teach basically the same kinds of students, who make 2 different decisions about how to use their class time. Teacher A is a teacher who allocates some of the class time to student-peer interaction. That, in fact, teacher A turns out to be basically the average teacher in the data that we have. Teacher B is very different. Teacher B allocates most of the time to student peer interaction. Teacher B's students will score about 5% of a standard deviation higher at the end of the year than teacher A's class. So more time on student peer interaction, higher GCSE scores. What does 5% of a standard deviation mean? It's roughly the same as these things that we've listed here. So 5% of a standard deviation is roughly the difference between being taught by a first-year teacher and a fifth-year teacher. So we all know there's a big growth in effectiveness in teaching over those years, and 5% is about the difference between a first and fifth-year teacher. It's about the same as adding 1.5 to 2 weeks of instruction to the school year. So, a non-trivial sort of increase in instruction. If we project into students' lives down the road, 5% of a standard deviation on the GCSEs in English is, worth perhaps, close to £5,000 in future earnings, higher earnings. It's also about 1/3 of the standard deviation in total teacher contributions to student achievement. So it's like taking a teacher and moving them up 1/3 of the way in the rankings of all teachers. So let me just go back quickly to this graph. And as I said, student peer interaction really stands out because there we're seeing that if you increase student peer interaction, test scores go up by 5% of a standard deviation. That's not true for the other uses of class time: direct instruction, personalized instruction, practice and assessment. All of those are down around 0. And to sort of reach back into your past statistics classes, the bars that extend out from the points are the confidence intervals. So you'll see they generally, for most of these, include 0, which means that we would say that these differences are not statistically significant. The one that is statistically significant is student peer interaction, which really stands out from the others. And there's 2 dots here. All that the second dot means is that when we try to compare teachers who have the same instructional effectiveness as measured by that rubric Shenila was mentioning, we see very similar results, which means that whether you're a teacher who's very effective in asking questions and managing student misbehavior, or whether you're a teacher who's just still learning how to do those things, it's still the case for both of those types of teachers that spending more time on student peer interaction improves GCSE scores. So I guess the last thing to say is that, this is something specific to English, as Bob was mentioning. So we can do the exact same exercise for math teachers and math GCSEs. And for math, it's actually spending more time on practice and assessment that increases GCSE scores, not student peer interaction. So this is something particular to English. And I'll just stop there. I turn the time over to Simon, but looking forward to your questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Eric and Shenila. So from me, I'm just going to give you a quick summary of the highlights of our project. give you a couple of points about the study that we used to undertake this, and then finally finish up with a couple of thoughts on what next. So as Shenila and then Eric said, our main question is, does it matter how teachers spend time in the class? Does it make a difference? The first question is, does time use differ? Is it the case that more or less all teachers use the time the same from one class to another, or is there a lot of variation? And in the example that Eric gave, we saw that there's, for some of the ways of teaching classes, there's no consensus among teachers. Something like a third, if we take another example of the use of the whiteboard, slightly more than a third of teachers use it hardly at all. Slightly more, about a third use it a little bit, and about a third use it a lot. So there's teachers are doing wildly different things. So if teacher time use does vary, between teachers, does this matter? Is this having an impact on students? And the answer is emphatically yes, it does. The statistical work that we did shows that. And as Eric said, the magnitude of moving from using student peer interaction a bit to using it a lot is like 2 extra weeks in school. So this is a significant magnitude. Okay, so those are our highlights of the study.
Simon,
in terms,
sorry, can I do one of those interruptions? Thank you. So we've got a question from the floor, which is if we could just define what we mean by student peer interaction, what that looks like in the class and how it's measured.
Okay, well, maybe if Eric could go back to the 2 underlying activities that go to make it up. It's there we go. Thank you. Perfect. So top left. So it's open discussion among students and teachers. So in my mind, at least, and Eric and Shenila may have other things to say, I'm imagining tables of students sat around, and within those tables, they're discussing the question that the teacher has set them. Maybe the teachers are getting involved in some of those discussions. So that's the idea that in the classroom, there's a general discussion going on amongst maybe all the students, or maybe they're split into tables and there's discussion on those. So the essential thing is it's not a sort of a one-way transmission from the teacher to the students. The second part is students working in groups. That's also included in student peer interaction. So here, I guess the students would be working maybe slightly more quietly in groups. Maybe the teacher would be sort of going around from group table to table to help them out a little bit. But again, it's sort of collaborative. It's sharing ideas, the students sharing ideas amongst themselves, and growing new ideas from that sharing. So that's the idea. Shenila, Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't want to add anything, only to say that the reason why that is in there is, in particular, when we were thinking about it, we thought it might be an important factor, and we didn't measure this specifically, or we don't have results on this, particularly where you have mixed ability classrooms. So in a lot of the schools that we went to, maths was taught streamed and English was not streamed. And some of the previous evidence that has emerged has talked about students working in groups and peer interaction as being particularly important when you have mixed ability classes, or potentially even if you have streamed classes as well. So
okay, thank you. So thanks for the question, by the way. Good question. I hope we gave you a good answer. So I'll press on for a little bit now, but please do ask more questions, and very shortly I'll be done too. So yeah, I wanted to make 2 points about this particular study. The first one is that it's very large scale, and Shenila's given you the numbers, but I think one study with 2,500 lesson observations by qualified teachers is among the largest, if not the largest, in England at the time. So this is much more than simply collecting a handful of lesson observations and trying to draw conclusions from those. So yeah, 7,000 students and 2,500, more than 2,500 lesson observations. I also want to make the point that we explicitly and deliberately focused on high poverty schools. So the schools in our sample, or on average had around 40% of students eligible for free school meals, which was about double the average at the time in 2013. This is obviously where the help is maybe most needed, but also we wanted to be able to say that, you know, these results apply in the neediest schools. It's not just about very well resourced schools full of very nicely behaved children. Let's put it that way. And then finally, what next? So we, as you can hopefully tell, we're still very enthusiastic and very excited about this project, and we're aiming to do more. Some of the things are things like this meeting. So thank you, Bob and Becky, for organising it. So to provide you takeaways for your senior leadership team. I mean, I think the centerpiece of our results is an actionable, a learnable thing. Just slightly adjusting the way you run your class, providing a little bit more time for this and a little less time for that, could make a difference. Okay, this is not about, you know, trying to improve teacher effectiveness, teacher skills overall, which, you know, is far too big and vague and complex a question. Just spend a little bit more time on this and spend a little bit less time on that. Okay, we're keen to push this more generally in England. I've presented this work to teacher educators at the IOE in London and in Bristol. I think they're perhaps not used to seeing evidence like this. I don't really know how this kind of thing, sort of class time use is taught. And then last of all, we're starting up a follow-up study in the United States. This is very, very, very early stages. We're just thinking how we can measure class activities. And then we might think about time use nudges for teachers, to see if we can see the similar effects. So yeah, that's me done. And that's all three of us done.
That's fantastic. There are some questions in the chat. Becky, do you want to carry on doing the chat?
Yes, of course, can do. Okay, so there's a little grouping of questions around gauging student understanding and how that was grouped. So it wasn't in the collection with other dialogic activities. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's grouped in the category we call practice and assessment. So that's grouped with students doing written work alone and homework or classwork during class. And again, the groups that we used here were based on empirically what was correlated in the data. So these are things that happen sort of, if you think about, there's a wide variety of teachers who do lots of different things. What are the sort of groups of teachers and what kinds of practices do they typically do in sort of conjunction with each other? That's how we came to the category of practice and assessment, and all of the categories for that matter. I mean, what differentiates the categories, what's especially important in this case, is what differentiates that student-peer interaction category, where we see improvements in GCSE scores, is that's the only category where students are interacting with each other substantially, right? So, you know, somebody else was asking about, like, well, surely there are sort of more and less effective ways for students to work together. We completely agree. We don't have any way to study that in this particular set of data, but just getting kids to work together, students to work together, that's the category where in English we see improvements.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for answering that question. There was also a question in there about COVID. With this research taking place before COVID and the introduction of remote learning and the impact that has had, can we speculate about whether it would be different if you did this again?
So this was very clearly before COVID, 2014, 15, 2015, 16. So happily, what the results are not affected by that. Would it be different now? I don't know. I don't know to what extent classroom design and proximity of tables and so on has gone back to what it was before, or whether they've remained further apart. So I don't think I can really say anything about that. So again, I'm looking at my co-authors.
I think from my experience, there are certain things that will have changed a lot. So I think if we were to do this again now, and interestingly, the teacher trainers did raise this, the use of technology would definitely be an activity that would be there. And in the classrooms that I've visited across research, even across the globe, I have noticed that there is a lot more use of, for example, laptops or surfaces or iPads and things like that. So I think that would definitely change things. But I think there was a lot of, and this is just my own opinion, but I think there was a lot of conversation about how COVID could be seen as an opportunity to change the way that teaching happens in classrooms. And to what extent has that actually happened? I think that would be a very, very interesting piece of research, particularly if it followed on from what we've seen here, because one would hope that we've taken the advantages of what happened then and sort of implemented them as opposed to just reverting. But I'll hand over to Eric if he's seen anything in the US.
Nothing to add.
Thank you. In that case, shall I hop over to another question, which is asking us to do a bit of speculation? Katie asks, is it possible that the results will be less clearly positive with schools with a lower percentage of FSM?
Good question. Good question. So we obviously all of the schools in our sample were not the same. So there were definitely some that were had lower fractions of children living in poverty. And I don't think we saw, I'm trying to remember what we did. I don't think we saw any big differences. We certainly did take account of the average Key Stage 2 scores in classrooms. So I think to that degree, to the extent that that's correlated with students taking free school, students eligible for free school meals, and I think we're accounting for differences between schools in that.
Yeah, and Simon, you're right. Yeah, you're right, Simon, that we did look at this. So the sample that we have are all schools with relatively high free school meals, but within that sample, some will be higher and some will be lower. And we did look to see whether the results were different within the sample for higher and lower free school meals, and we didn't find evidence that was the case. Now, what would happen with schools outside of our sample is a little bit harder, I guess, to say.
Thank you. A quick one here from Emma, who says, if student-peer interaction has the most impact on outcomes, which classroom practice has the least impact on outcomes?
Yeah, well, maybe this is a chance to just put this slide back up a little again. I know it went by fast. So here are the four categories. So, I mean, least, if practice and assessment, that category as a group had the smallest. Increasing time on practice and assessment had the smallest effect on English scores. Of course, it had the biggest effect on math scores. But as I said, this relationship is not statistically significant. So it's possible that this is just an artifact of the sample that we drew, and that actually the amount of time on practice and assessment doesn't have much of an effect at all. The only one where there was a clear effect was in English was student and peers interacting with each other, whether in the whole class or in small groups.
Thank you very much. We have another question. This might be our last one. We'll see. Brian asks, were there any insights on more effective sequencing of activities, i.e., when during a class the student-peer interaction has the most impact?
Great question. Short answer is no. As Shenila was saying, we have several observations for each teacher, but they're coming at different times during the class. Hopefully some of the work that we're doing in the future will allow us to tackle a question like that. I don't think it was on our list, but now it is. That's a great question.
And actually, I was mentioning about why we chose to do most of the time, a little bit of the time, as opposed to another way that classroom observations are usually done by economists is by ticking each minute. So actually, had we collected our data in that way, we would know that peer interaction is happening in the first 5 minutes of the lesson or the last 5 minutes of the lesson, and we could disaggregate and look at the results across that timing. But we wouldn't have it for this measure within our data.
Great question.
Do we want to take one more quick one and then wrap up? I've got one eye on the clock.
Yeah, okay. There's one that just came in, which is asking to contextualize the data types. Was the measure of opportunities for student peer interactions in English and maths equal? Was there a correlation between the outcomes at 4 and 5? The second part of that question has lost me, I confess, so I'm hoping my colleagues can pick that one up.
We definitely don't go anywhere near age 4. Oh, grade 4 or 5. Thank you. So we used the Key Stage 2 score which students take at age 10 or 11 as a measure of the prior attainment of the students. I don't know, what do we think?
When we look at how teachers actually spend time, it's actually very similar between maths and English. Despite the fact that the results are very different, the choices that in our sample that teachers were making were very similar. So in terms of opportunity, I don't know, that's maybe there's some nuances there, but if we just look at the data and how teachers spent time, there's just as much student peer interaction going on in English as there is in maths, and there's just as much practice and assessment going on in English as there is in maths.
Yeah, and exactly. And I think you could argue that given that we take account of the some of the characteristics of the students, that the teacher in each classroom is more or less the same. So the opportunities in each classroom is probably roughly more or less the same. Well, obviously they'll be different in detail, but every teacher has roughly an hour with the same group of kids, and they could, if they wished, do a little bit more or a little bit less of some of the things.
Folks, we're all one eye at a time, busy lives. First of all, I want to stress what an amazing bit of research I think this is, and now we've seen it in more detail, that the peer interaction in English literally gets better GCSE results. So that's what you can tell your senior management team when they roll their eyes at you. I think this is just really amazing, and I say it's gold-plated research. And I would really like to thank Eric, Simon, and Shenila for doing the research and for taking the time to present to us. Really, really grateful. We're going to make sure that as much information will circulate out to you as possible. And I just want to finish by saying thank you again. Really, really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Okay.